Hey everybody. All right. So today we are going to start off on a little bit of a different topic. Right up until this point, we've discussed some of these foundational elements. We've discussed the kinds of things that we do in order to go through this strategy making, strategy executing process, and we've branched out to discuss this idea of how do we assess the external environment we're a part of. But obviously, that external environment, the things that happen to us, the environment that we're a part of, it's not everything. We also want to focus on our internal environment. We want to focus at those things, like it says right here, what kind of resources that we currently have, our ability to compete successfully. How do these internal realities within our organization affect our ability to compete successfully moving forward? So it kind of makes sense that we would start right here by if we're going to start assessing some of these things, we should have a good grasp of understanding how well our current strategy is working. How well this strategy we've currently employed, is it really getting us where we're trying to get to, right? So essentially right here, this model gives us a really good overview of the things we can begin to look at in order to determine what our firm's strategy is and how well it is currently working, right? All of these different moving parts that you see pointing toward this business strategy at the epicenter of this model right here are all the things that we've got to look to in order to begin to really get a grasp of what our strategy is and how then, as a result, how well it's working, right? So of all of these elements, right, take all of these things that are listed here, a hodgepodge of different things about our organization. All these elements together help us to identify a few things that are very important to us. At first is, what is our firm's competitive approach? Now, what we mean by that is we've talked very briefly about this a few times. We haven't really elaborated on it yet, so don't worry if you don't feel like you really know what I'm talking about just yet. But all these elements help us figure out the firm's competitive approach, right? What is our competitive approach? Things like, are we a low cost provider? What kind of value do we provide? Do people buy things? Is our value proposition based off of giving them the lowest cost possible? Or are we more of a differentiator, right? Do we have a better product or service or a different product or service from others? Along some lines, do we differentiate ourselves? Is that really where we provide people our value? And we'll elaborate more on these moving forward too. Do we have a superior ability, to serve a particular market niche or a certain group of buyers that other people can't, right? All of these things, understanding these elements about the internal reality of our organization are going to give us good insight into what our competitive approach really is. What is our competitive approach? How do we provide value is really what that competitive approach is all about. But we'll elaborate on that just a little bit more later, excuse me. Now, it also gives us some insight into our business's competitive scope, right? Later, we'll look at a matrix that says, are we cost leaders or differentiators? And then do we have a broad or do we have a narrow scope, right? So do we cover a broad or a really narrow geographic market coverage, or a really big, wide market where we serve tons and tons of people, or a really narrow one? Or do we have a wide or narrow product line? Do we offer everything under the sun, or do we only offer things that are very specialized and focused, right? These elements also give us a snapshot or an idea of our recent strategic moves and our current functional strategies. So what these mean, we will elaborate more on later, excuse me. But this model should give us, by considering some of the things that are on here and how we have acted, these give us some good insight into the realities of a couple of these specific elements. Now, the three major indicators of how we tell how well our strategy that we're currently employing, that we've kind of determined by that previous model, how well they're working, the major indicators that can help us determine how well it's working are actually quite simple, I think, right? Are we currently meeting or beating those targets we set for for ourselves? we've talked about this as a metric of success before already, right? Are we performing above the industry averages? Like we started off saying, we don't need to be the best, but we need to be performing at or above our industry averages, hopefully above. That's really what we're looking at. That's what superior performance is all about. And are we gaining customers, or are we out competing our closest rivals, those people who are closest together with us on that strategic map that we showed on an earlier lecture, right? So are we gaining customers? Are we out competing? Are we performing above average? And are we beating the targets that we've set for each other? These are major indicators to say whether or not, because if we say no to these things, likely our strategy is not working. And if we are, it is usually a great signal of a strategy that was well thought out of, conceptualized well, planned, executed, evaluated, used feedback effectively with, continue to create new iterations that work better and better. Largely that strategy is working if we can say yes to these things. So persistent shortfalls when we are meeting or when we're like not meeting performance expectations, or we have weak performance relative to our rivals, just remember these are all signals that our strategy is not working, right? Hopefully this makes very straightforward common sense, hopefully, to you, right? But there are a lot of different ways that we can determine these things, and I'm not going to exacerbate these things and go through them one by one for you, but I will provide them for you in case you'd like to look over them. We're not going to test you over these financial metrics, but these are all just ways that we can determine, or essentially metrics we can use to determine whether or not we are performing well or not, right? We use things like profitability ratios, right? A type of financial metric that we use in order to basically assess our business's ability to generate earnings relative to its revenue, right? Things that help us determine if we are actually making money or just covering our costs. We also use things like liquidity ratios, which basically are financial ratios that measure our company's ability to pay off our debt obligations, another important thing for our business. Leverage ratios, right? What proportion of debt do we have compared to our equity or our capital? Very important thing to take into consideration. Could be activity ratios, all these kinds of things. Like I said, I'll give you all of these as examples. You don't need to memorize them. We're not going to test you necessarily on them, but just understanding that there are a wide range of financial metrics we can use in order to, use as signals to us as to whether or not our current strategy is performing at or exceeding our expectations for what we want from it.